Welcome back to Leadership Devotionals. For today, we have an interesting topic. It is entitled, The Leader's Identity. Now, this is the first of a series. The Leader's Identity. The question that we're going to answer is, who are you really? Now, this is very important because your identity basically defines you as a person and how much more as a leader. Now, let me divert your attention to a text in the Bible, and it's a beautiful text. It's the letter of Saint Paul to the Christians in Rome. So you can find the text in Romans chapter 1, verse 1. Now, notice this leader of the early Christian church, Apostle Paul, how he introduced himself to the Christians in Rome. I read from the King James Version. Paul, okay, that's his name, a servant of Jesus Christ, okay, that's the first description, called to be an apostle, the second description, and separated unto the gospel of God. Or in the New International Version, it says, set apart for the gospel of God. Paul has introduced himself beautifully. And these are basically the attributes or the character traits of a leader, of him being a leader. And he beautifully worded it as Paul, a servant of God, called to be an apostle, and set apart for the gospel of Christ. So let's try to dissect this one by one. The first description is a servant of God. As a leader, Paul is truly embodied the leadership principle that Jesus Christ has left here when he was here on earth. That is being a servant leader. That's how he introduced himself. Paul, being a servant of Jesus Christ. It denotes humility. Okay, it denotes humility. And from our previous episode of the Leaders of Tomorrow, you will realize there that leaders of tomorrow should have a certain intellectual humility with them. Jim Collins identified the level 5 leaders in his book Good to Great as persons with an exceptional humility. So Paul here is describing himself as someone subservient to a higher power that directs his moves, directs his decisions, and even his actions. Connected to the most influential leader of all time, and of course that is Jesus Christ, even to God himself. So that is the first description of Paul. The second description of Paul is, he said, called to be an apostle. Leaders are basically called. Okay? Leaders are called. Yes, we may apply for leadership, but the decision of the committee or the governing board that appoints us to leadership, to the spiritual leader, is a calling from God. And so Paul described himself here as someone called to be an apostle. Apostles before, during that time, were basically the leaders of the early Christian church. And so, if we have to reword this, called to be an apostle is called to be a leader. And from what background did Paul come from? Of course, we know that he was a Pharisee. And as a Pharisee, he had studied diligently, definitely the scriptures. And the scriptures during Paul's time is about the Old Testament. But then, it doesn't necessarily mean because he had studied the scriptures that he has the right understanding. Because he had a distorted understanding on what the prophets wrote about the Messiah. Because he was persecuting the followers of the Messiah. Okay? The followers of the very Messiah that has been foretold by the prophets hundreds of years ago. And so one dusty day, with an all-encompassing arrest warrant with him from the high priest in Jerusalem, he was going on his way to Damascus in order to drag the Christians there and bring them to Jerusalem for trial. But while he was on his way to persecute more followers of Christ, he was stopped by a bright shining light. His calling was dramatic. After realizing that he was doing the wrong thing, after realizing that he was doing the wrong thing, because the voice in the light said, "Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he said, "Who is this?" And he answered, "This is Jesus Christ of Nazareth." And after realizing that he was doing the wrong thing, Paul immediately submitted. Paul immediately submitted to the higher powers of God. And then he asked a very, very important question for a leader. "Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? Lord, what do you want me to do?" You know, every Christian leader, every spiritual leader should be asking this question every morning or every time he indulges himself in his leadership journey. Every Christian leader should always submit themselves to God. "Lord, what will you want me to do today to advance your mission? What do you want me to do today to accomplish your will in this organization? Lord, what do you want me to do in order that through the accomplishments of this company, this corporation, this institution, or this organization, your name will be glorified? Lord, what will you want me to do?" It's a question, but at the same time, it is a testament of submission, of humility. And fellow leaders, once God answers that question, God's answer will be your empowerment from God Himself to fulfill His will for you and for your organization. The last part of the text says, "separated unto the gospel of God." That's how Paul described himself, or set apart for the gospel of God. Having been set apart means there is a special work for this Christian leader that God has appointed for him to do. Paul is the first missionary to evangelize outside of Judea and the country of Israel, even reaching as far as Rome. Paul has that distinct identification as that kind of missionary, going to various areas, to Greece, to Thessalonica, to Colossae, and all the other areas. He was separated for a special work. Leaders, you have been called by God. And you should remember that you have been separated for a special work. And that is God's mission statement for you. That is God's vision for your work. Because when Paul identified himself as separated unto the gospel of God, that becomes Paul's work. That becomes Paul's mission. That becomes Paul's vision. That becomes his life work. In fact, in Philippians 3 verse 13, when 13 and 14, in the process of his leadership maturation, this is what Paul wrote to the people of Philippi. He said, "Brethren, I count not myself to have apprehended, but this one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind, and reaching forth unto those things which are before." That's a function of vision. "I press toward the mark for the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus." He found his work because he was set aside for the gospel of God. No wonder when he wrote the people in Corinth, this was his declaration in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 10. "But by the grace of God, I am that I am." He already knew his identity. I am that I am. "And his grace which was bestowed upon me," okay? He was a recipient of God's grace. That's why he knows his identity. He said, "And his grace that was bestowed upon me was not in vain, because I labored more abundantly than they all." I became a lot more productive having known my real identity. Paul's identity was secured in Christ. A servant of Christ, called for a purpose, and set apart for the gospel of Christ. His the work he does. His work is to do the will of God. And his life is all about the gospel of Christ. Fellow leaders, Paul, when he knew his identity, and he is secured in his identity, it gave him the humility and yet the passion and the focus to proceed on God's word. I challenge you today. Who are you really? Your identity will determine your performance as a leader. God bless you.